In the vast Wyoming wilderness, where nature's untamed beauty meets its raw power, a single act of compassion was about to unfold, one that would forge an extraordinary bond between man and beast, leaving an entire community in awe. For Thomas Warren, a 68-year-old former rancher living alone in his remote cabin, that life-changing moment arrived on a bitter winter morning. A piercing, heart-wrenching cry shattered the frozen silence. A sound that would not only save two lost souls, but create a legacy of hope, touching countless lives. What happens when fate intervenes in the depths of winter? How can a single act of courage ripple through time, mending hearts and bringing a town together? Join us on this incredible journey of trust, redemption, and the unexpected connections that remind us what it truly means to be human. If you believe in the power of compassion, like this video and subscribe to witness more extraordinary stories of hope and resilience in our wild world. The January wind howled through the snow-laden pines, rattling the windows of Thomas Warren's weathered cabin. At his age, the cold gnawed at his joints more than he cared to admit, but his morning routine remained unchanged. Wrapped in thick wool, he stood by the kitchen window, hands cradling a steaming cup of coffee as the sun struggled to break through the heavy clouds. On the windowsill sat a framed photo of Sarah, her warm smile untouched by time. 2 years had passed since she left him, yet some mornings he still turned to share a thought, only to find an empty space where she once stood. Another storm coming, Sarah, he murmured, his breath fogging the glass. You'd say I'm too old to be out here alone, wouldn't you? He could almost hear her teasing response. Age is just a number, Tommy. It's the heart that counts. This cabin had been their dream, a place to retire after selling the ranch, to grow old together, watching the Wyoming seasons shift like a living canvas. Now, it was just Thomas, his solitude broken only by weekly supply runs to the small town, 20 miles away. Outside, the morning light deepened, painting the snow-covered meadow in soft pinks and golds. With a sigh, Thomas pulled on his heavy coat, preparing for his daily check of the land. The land needs tending, Tommy, just like the heart does. His boots crunched in the fresh snow as he stepped onto the porch. The thermometer read 15 below, bitter even for January. The cold burned his lungs, each breath crystallizing into tiny clouds that drifted into the wind. A red-tailed hawk circled above the tree line, its graceful movements a reminder of how Sarah loved tracking their patterns. He paused, watching the bird's silent flight, until a sound shattered the quiet. A cry. Not just any cry. This was raw, desperate, filled with terror and agony. Thomas froze, coffee mug halfway to his lips. He knew every sound these mountains made, the haunting call of wolves, the bugle of an elk. But this was different. A horse's scream. His chest tightened. Dear God! The cry came again, weaker this time, carrying from the direction of Crystal Creek. His mind raced. Wild mustangs roamed these parts, but the nearest ranch was miles away. Whatever was happening, it was bad. Without hesitation, he hurried inside, grabbing his emergency pack, the one Sarah had insisted he always keep ready. Better to have it and not need it, she'd say, than need it and not have it. He added rope, a thermal blanket, and his old veterinary kit from his ranching days before heading out. The creek was half a mile away, but the deep snow and bone-chilling wind turned the trek into a battle. His breath came in sharp bursts, each step an effort against the knee-high drifts. As he neared the creek, the cries grew clearer. Through the swirling snow he caught movement, a large, dark shape thrashing violently against the frozen landscape. Thomas rounded the bend and stopped cold. A massive black stallion, at least 17 hands high, was trapped in the ice. The horse had broken through the frozen creek, its powerful body half submerged in the deadly water. Jagged shards of ice surrounded it like a prison, cutting into its heaving flanks with each desperate struggle. Steam rose from its soaked coat as its muscles quaked with exhaustion. Then its eyes met his, wild with fear. But in that moment, Something passed between them, a recognition, a plea. The stallion stilled, as if sensing that help had arrived. Thomas's heart pounded. He had seen trapped animals before, but never one like this. Trying to rescue a panicked horse from frozen water was a suicidal risk. One wrong move, and he could be dragged under, his own life lost to the unforgiving cold. But leaving it to freeze to death? Unthinkable. A brutal gust of wind cut through his coat, and thick flakes of snow began to fall. The storm Sarah had warned him about was closing in fast. If he was going to act, it had to be now. His boots crunched on the thin ice as he took a cautious step forward. Then, in his mind, Sarah's voice came as clear as the winter air. Sometimes, Tommy, the biggest risks bring the greatest rewards. The ice groaned beneath Thomas's boots, and the stallion's head shot up, eyes flashing with a mix of fear and something deeper, an intelligence that mirrored his own. There was trust there, fragile but real, and a fierce will to survive. "All right, then," Thomas murmured, unwinding the rope from his pack. "Let's get you out of there, beautiful." The wind howled louder, driving the snow sideways, but he barely noticed. His world had shrunk to this single moment, this impossible challenge. The stallion needed him, and no storm would change that. What happened next would not only alter his life, but would ripple through the town in ways no one could have predicted, proving that even in the coldest wilderness, compassion could spark a fire that never faded. The snow whipped against his face as he edged closer to the trapped horse, each step carefully measured. One wrong move, and this rescue could turn into a tragedy for both of them. The stallion's breaths came in visible bursts of steam, eyes never leaving him. Its trembling body, whether from cold or exhaustion, was coated in ice, but it remained still, as if sensing that hope had arrived. "Steady now," Thomas said, his voice barely cutting through the wind. Decades of ranching had taught him patience, but this was unlike anything he had faced before. He could see where the animal had fought, its front leg plunging through the ice first, followed by its hindquarters. Each attempt to escape had only worsened the damage, deepening the gashes along its flanks where sharp shards had sliced through its hide. He tested the ice with his rope before moving forward, the old wisdom echoing in his mind. Ice is like trust. Test it before you stake your life on it. The stallion watched intently, ears flicking toward the movement, following every shift of the rope with an eerie understanding. 15 feet now. The wind cut through his layers like knives, numbing his fingers even through his gloves. The horse nickered softly, barely audible against the storm, but the sound carried reassurance. It was no longer the panicked cries of a dying creature, but something almost encouraging. "That's right," Thomas muttered. "Just stay with me." His hands fumbled against the cold, struggling with the knots, but he forced himself to stay steady. Slow as smooth, smooth as fast. Sarah's voice was clear in his mind, grounding him. He exhaled, steadying his grip, and finished the loop with careful precision. 10 feet. The ice shifted beneath him, sending a jolt of fear through his spine. The stallion flinched but didn't panic, still watching him with that same steady gaze. The trust in its eyes gave him the strength to keep going. He could see everything now. The deep cuts, the steam rising from its soaked coat, the sheer power barely restrained within its freezing frame. 5 feet. His breath burned in his throat as he reached out. The rope extended, heart pounding in time with the wind. The stallion didn't flinch as the loop settled around its neck. "Good boy," Thomas whispered, relief washing over him. Now came the hardest part. He secured the rope to a nearby tree, creating an anchor point, ensuring the pull would be strong but controlled. The stallion stood motionless, as if sensing this was its best chance. He braced himself, shifting into position, but before he could begin pulling, a sickening crack split the air. The ice beneath his feet shattered. Time seemed to slow as he felt himself falling. The freezing water hit like a sledgehammer, stealing his breath, searing into his bones. Pain shot through his limbs as he fought the instinct to thrash. He needed to move, needed to get out before the cold locked his muscles in place. Above him, the stallion let out a piercing whinny, its eyes wide with alarm. Thomas's fingers scraped against jagged edges of ice, struggling for grip. His vision blurred as the cold sank deeper, turning each movement sluggish. He had seconds, maybe less. Then, through the blur of snow and pain, he saw something unbelievable. The stallion shifted, its powerful body surging forward despite the ice holding it back. The rope pulled taut. The horse was trying to save him. Desperation gave him strength. He kicked against the current, lungs burning, his hand finally finding the solid edge of the ice. With everything he had left, he hauled himself up, gasping as he rolled onto firmer ground. His body shook violently, but he forced himself to focus. The stallion was still trapped. Ignoring the cold seeping into his bones, he gritted his teeth and grabbed the rope. Every pull sent fire through his muscles, but inch by inch, the stallion responded. Its front leg found purchase, its hindquarters pushing against the ice, hooves kicking at the frozen edge. One final pull. With a powerful surge, the stallion heaved itself free, collapsing onto the snow beside him. Its body quaked from exhaustion, sides heaving, but it was out. It was alive. Thomas let out a breathless laugh, his chest heaving, his hands still gripping the rope, as though his body hadn't yet registered that the fight was over. The stallion turned its head, locking eyes with him once more. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, the horse lowered its head, its breath warm against his frozen skin. A thank you. The storm howled around them, but in that moment, nothing else existed. Two souls, both on the brink, had saved each other. He reached up, brushing his shaking fingers along the stallion's soaked mane. "We made it," he murmured, voice hoarse. "You're one hell of a fighter, you know that." The stallion let out a soft snort, as if in agreement. They weren't out of danger yet. He had to get them both to shelter before the cold claimed them. Forcing his body to move, he pushed himself up, gripping the rope with weak but determined hands. Felt as if the stallion understood his words. There was something ancient in its gaze, a wisdom that defied logic, as if it had seen more than just the wild landscapes of Wyoming. The thought sent a shiver down his spine, though not from the cold. Thomas exhaled slowly, running his hand over the stallion's neck. The warmth beneath his palm was grounding, a reminder that this was real. He had spent his life around horses, yet this one felt different, not just in stature or markings, but in presence. The morning sun stretched over the snow-covered land, casting long golden rays across the valley. The storm had passed, leaving the world quiet, untouched. Thomas hesitated for a moment before stepping toward the door. He knew he had to open it, had to give the stallion the choice to leave. It belonged to the wild, and keeping it here, no matter how much he wanted to, was not his decision to make. He reached for the handle and pulled. The cold rushed in instantly, crisp and sharp, filling the cabin with the scent of pine and fresh snow. The stallion lifted its head, ears flicking toward the open doorway. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, with deliberate steps, the horse walked toward the threshold. Thomas held his breath, waiting, his chest tight with something he couldn't name. The stallion paused just outside, lifting its head to taste the air, taking in the vast wilderness before it. This was it. Thomas braced himself for the inevitable, for the moment when the stallion would bolt, disappearing into the trees, becoming nothing more than a memory. But instead of running, the horse turned back, stepping once more into the warmth of the cabin, brushing against his shoulder as if reassuring him. The simple action unraveled something deep inside him. A chuckle escaped him, rough and full of relief. "Guess you're not in a hurry, huh?" The stallion gave a soft huff, shaking its mane as if in response. Thomas left the door open, allowing the cold and the warmth to mix, letting fate decide what would happen next. The horse had saved him as much as he had saved it, and perhaps, just perhaps, it wasn't ready to leave yet. He stepped back to the hearth, pouring another cup of coffee, letting the silence settle between them. The stallion watched him, standing in the doorway between two worlds, one of wild freedom, the other of quiet companionship. As Thomas sipped his coffee, he found himself speaking without thinking. Sarah always said some horses are old souls, that they find who they need when the time is right. The stallion didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there, steady as ever. Outside, the snow glistened under the rising sun, the world fresh and waiting. Thomas didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in years, he was in no hurry to find out. "Come on, beautiful," he whispered. "Let's get home." The stallion's proud head turned slightly toward the man, their bond captured in a single frame. The image spoke of something deeper than mere survival. It was a testament to the unbreakable connection forged between them. The story spread far beyond Silver Creek. What began as a local legend quickly gained national attention. News outlets picked up Rebecca's article, and soon calls poured in from across the country. Equestrian magazines, breeders, and even researchers in genetics wanted to know more about the mysterious black stallion with the rare markings. Some were interested in Storm's lineage, others in the almost mythical way he had come into Thomas's life. But for those in Silver Creek, the story wasn't about bloodlines or prestige. It was about something far more profound. Thomas, for his part, took the sudden attention in stride. He had never sought recognition, nor had he expected the world beyond his quiet mountain town to take interest in his life. But as experts arrived to see Storm, as cameras flashed and reporters asked their questions, he remained grounded in the truth of what mattered. Storm wasn't just a remarkable horse. He was a reminder of resilience, of companionship, of the way healing often came in unexpected forms. Dr. Elizabeth Morgan was among the first to arrive, her excitement evident as she studied the stallion. With careful precision, she examined Storm's conformation, his gait, his reactions. Her team conducted tests, compared markings, and reviewed old breeding records. After days of study, her conclusion was clear. "This horse," she said, barely containing her excitement, "is a direct descendant of the Midnight Dancer line. His bloodline was thought to be lost. And yet, here he is." The significance of her words rippled through the equestrian world. The Midnight Dancer lineage was legendary, not just for its rarity, but for the intelligence and almost human-like connection these horses shared with their handlers. Storm was living proof that the line had survived against all odds. Breeders and collectors made offers, some willing to pay staggering amounts to take Storm into their stables. But Thomas had made up his mind long, before any of them arrived. "He's not for sale," he said simply, brushing his fingers through Storm's thick mane. "He's where he belongs." Rebecca wasn't surprised by his decision. She had watched the bond between them deepen, seen the way Storm responded to Thomas with an understanding few could explain. As weeks passed, the media attention slowly faded, but something lasting had taken root in Silver Creek. People who had known Thomas as a quiet, grieving man now saw him with new light in his eyes. He was no longer just a rancher who had lost his wife. He was the man who had saved a legend. Storm, for his part, had settled into life at the cabin with effortless grace. He helped gather firewood, cleared snow from paths, and even seemed to greet visitors with a knowing nod. Those who came to see him left with a sense of awe, as if they had witnessed something extraordinary. One crisp morning, as Thomas stood by the paddock, coffee in hand, he watched Storm trot across the snowy field, his black coat shining in the pale light. The stallion stopped at the fence, looking at him with that same steady gaze. "You thinking of leaving?" Thomas asked, his voice calm but knowing. Storm exhaled softly, ears flicking forward. The world had opened its doors to him, offering him a place among the finest horses in history. But he remained, choosing the quiet cabin over grand stables, choosing companionship over pedigree. Thomas chuckled, shaking his head. "Guess you've made up your mind, then." Storm pressed his muzzle against his shoulder, a silent affirmation. Sarah would have loved him, Thomas thought. She would have understood, just as he did now, that some connections weren't built on ownership or expectation. They were built on trust, on something deeper that couldn't be named but was felt with every shared moment. The sun climbed higher, melting the last traces of frost from the fence. The mountains stretched beyond them, vast and untamed, a world of open possibilities. Storm could go anywhere, and yet he stayed. Jack barely waited for his truck to come to a full stop before jumping out, urgency written all over his weathered face. Storm lifted his head, ears pricked forward, sensing the tension before a word was spoken. "They're pushing through the land sale," Jack said, breathless. "The north pasture, the one we talked about for the wild herds, it's going to auction next month. Developers want it." Thomas set down his coffee, his stomach tightening. That land was one of the last safe corridors for the wild horses in the region. If it fell into the hands of developers, it would mean fencing, roads, and the end of the natural migration paths. Rebecca had already pulled out her notebook. "Who owns the rights?" she asked, her mind shifting into reporter mode. Jack rubbed the back of his neck. "The old Benson estate. Their kids never cared much for the land. And now that both their parents are gone, they're looking to cash out fast." Thomas looked toward the meadow where Storm grazed, his sleek black coat gleaming in the morning sun. This land had become a sanctuary not just for him, but for the wild herds that passed through, drawn to the presence of a leader among them. Storm had changed so much. Could he change this too? "What can we do?" Thomas asked, already knowing he wasn't willing to stand by and watch the land be taken. Rebecca tapped her pen against her chin, her mind already working through possibilities. "We need to go public. The momentum from Storm's story is still strong. If we raise enough awareness, we might be able to stall the sale or at least convince the town to reconsider the land's purpose." Jack sighed. "It's a lot of money, Thomas. We're talking real estate developers with deep pockets." Thomas met his gaze steadily. "And we have something they don't, a community that cares." That afternoon, Rebecca reached out to contacts at national media outlets, hoping to reignite interest in Storm's story. Within hours, emails flooded in. People wanted updates, interviews, to know what had happened since the world first learned about the stallion that had changed Silver Creek. By evening, Thomas's phone was ringing nonstop. Equine conservation groups, ranchers, even school teachers from across the country were offering support. But words and goodwill weren't enough. They needed action. "We have one shot at this," Rebecca said as they sat around Thomas's dining table, sorting through messages. "We need a fundraiser, a petition, something big enough to make the town council listen." Jack leaned forward, an idea forming. "What if we held a gathering? A demonstration of what this land means, not just for the wild herds, but for the community? Storm has already proven he can bring people together. Let's use that." The plan was set. Over the next 2 weeks, preparations took over Silver Creek. Flyers were printed, social media campaigns launched, and word spread beyond the small town. Horse trainers, conservationists, and even children who had visited Storm came forward to support the cause. The day of the event arrived with clear blue skies and the warmth of spring in the air. Hundreds gathered at the north pasture, where a temporary stage had been set up. Storm stood at Thomas's side, calm and regal, as if he understood the weight of the moment. One by one, speakers took the stage. Local ranchers who had seen the impact of the wild herds, biologists who spoke of their ecological importance, and townspeople who had found inspiration in Storm's story. But it was Thomas who silenced the crowd when he stepped forward. He took a deep breath, looking out at the faces before him. "I've lived here for most of my life, worked this land, raised horses, built a home with the woman I loved. And after she passed, I thought I had lost my place in the world." He turned toward Storm, resting a hand on the stallion's powerful neck. "Then this one came out of the storm and reminded me that some things are worth fighting for. This land, this way of life, it's not just dirt and grass. It's a legacy. And if we let it go, we lose something we can't ever get back." Applause rippled through the crowd, but it was the moment Storm stepped forward, lifting his head and letting out a powerful, resonant call that truly captured their hearts. It was as if he was speaking for all the wild horses that couldn't. By the time the event ended, the petition had gathered thousands of signatures, and donors had pledged enough funds to make an offer on the land. The town council had no choice but to listen. A month later, the Benson heirs withdrew their sale to the developers. Instead, they accepted an offer from a coalition of conservationists and local ranchers, ensuring the land would remain untouched, a sanctuary for the horses that had roamed these mountains for generations. When the news arrived, Thomas stood on his porch, watching as Storm trotted through the meadow, free as he was always meant to be. Rebecca and Jack stood beside him, the weight of their victory settling in. "We did it," Rebecca said, a mix of relief and joy in her voice. Thomas nodded, his gaze never leaving Storm. "No," he said quietly. He did. As the wind carried the scent of spring through the valley, Thomas knew that this was more than just saving a piece of land. It was proof that stories had power, that connections, no matter how unexpected, could change the course of history. And somewhere in the vast Wyoming wilderness, a man and a horse continued their journey together, not just as legend, but as proof of what could happen when trust, determination, and the spirit of the wild came together as one. That the morning light cast a golden glow over the sanctuary, illuminating the bond between a man and his horse. Their connection had become something more than just companionship. It had shaped the lives of many, spreading far beyond the quiet valley where it had all begun. Storm stood beside Thomas, his dark coat now showing signs of age, though his spirit remained unchanged. The stallion carried himself with the same quiet dignity he always had, his presence a steady force in a world that had come to admire him. As the day began, Thomas watched visitors arrive, their eyes filled with wonder. Children pointed excitedly, their laughter filling the air, while researchers took notes, eager to learn from the legendary stallion. Among them were people whose lives had been changed, those who had come searching for healing and found it in the quiet understanding of a remarkable horse. Thomas greeted them warmly, sharing stories, answering questions, and watching as Storm moved through the sanctuary with his usual grace. His influence extended far beyond the herd. He had become a symbol of what was possible when trust, patience, and respect bridged the gap between man and nature. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the mountains, the sanctuary gathered for their tradition, the sunset ceremony. It was a moment of reflection, of gratitude, and of celebrating the journey that had led them here. Storm led the herds through the valley, their movements synchronized in an unspoken rhythm, a sight that left even the most seasoned trainers in awe. Thomas stood beside Rebecca, who had long since become part of the story, chronicling its evolution and ensuring that its impact would continue to reach others. She watched as the horses moved, the setting sun painting their coats in hues of amber and gold. "You ever think about how much has changed?" she asked softly. Thomas nodded, his gaze fixed on Storm. Every day, there had been struggles, moments of uncertainty, battles they hadn't been sure they could win. But standing there, watching Storm guide his herd, knowing the land was protected, seeing the lives that had been transformed, it was clear they had built something lasting. Storm trotted back toward Thomas, his movements as fluid as ever, his eyes filled with the same quiet wisdom that had drawn them together all those years ago. The stallion pressed his forehead gently against Thomas's chest, their silent gesture of understanding. "You know what Sarah would say," Thomas murmured. Storm's ears flicked forward, as if waiting for the words he already knew. "She'd say the best things in life come when we least expect them." The horse let out a soft nicker, and together, they stood beneath the fading light, two souls who had changed each other in ways neither could have imagined. Their story had begun in the cold, on the edge of survival, but it had become something much greater, a legacy of trust, healing, and the unbreakable connection between man and horse. And as the stars began at the sky, the sanctuary hummed with quiet life, a reminder that some bonds were meant to last forever.